As the world teetered on the edge of darkness, America emerged not just as a participant, but as the turning force of a global conflict. Factories roared to life, soldiers stormed distant shores, and secret strategies reshaped battlefields. Every decision, every sacrifice, every invention brought the Allies closer to victory, proving that in World War II, America's role wasn't just pivotal, was decisive. World War II, which had already begun in 1939, initially saw the United States maintaining a cautious distance from the direct conflict. While much of Europe and Asia had been engulfed in violence, the American government and public opinion were largely focused on avoiding another large-scale foreign war. The memory of World War I, which had cost the United States heavily in both lives and resources, was still fresh. As a result, isolationism dominated American politics during the late 1930s, and there was strong resistance to direct military involvement in overseas conflicts. Despite this outward stance of neutrality, the United States was far from indifferent to the unfolding global crisis. American leaders, particularly President Franklin D. Roosevelt, closely monitored the rapid expansion of Nazi Germany in Europe and Imperial Japan in Asia. Roosevelt understood that the fall of democratic nations posed a direct threat to global stability and, ultimately, to American security. While the U.S. did not immediately enter the war, it began laying the groundwork for possible involvement long before 1941. During the first 2 years of the war, the United States quietly but decisively prepared for large-scale military engagement. Industrial production was expanded at an unprecedented rate, transforming the American economy into what would later be called the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once produced civilian goods were converted to manufacture tanks, aircraft, ships, weapons, and ammunition. This massive industrial mobilization ensured that when the United States did enter the war, it would do so with overwhelming material strength. At the same time, the U.S. government invested heavily in strengthening its armed forces. Military training programs were expanded, and new bases were constructed across the country. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 marked the first peacetime draft in American history, signaling that the nation was preparing for a conflict of unprecedented scale. Millions of young men were registered, trained, and gradually molded into a modern fighting force capable of operating across multiple continents. Although officially neutral, the United States increasingly supported the Allied powers, particularly Great Britain. After the fall of France in 1940, Britain stood virtually alone against Nazi Germany. Recognizing the strategic importance of Britain's survival, the United States provided extensive economic and military assistance through programs such as Lend-Lease. This allowed Britain and later other Allied nations to receive vital supplies without immediate payment, ensuring that they could continue resisting Axis aggression. In addition to aiding Britain, the United States also took steps to counter Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Japan's invasion of China and its ambitions across Southeast Asia alarmed American policymakers. In response, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions and trade embargoes, particularly targeting oil and steel exports, resources essential to Japan's war machine. These measures heightened tensions between the two nations and pushed Japan toward a confrontation it believed was inevitable. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, marked the dramatic turning point in American involvement in World War II. A surprise assault by Japanese forces destroyed much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and resulted in the loss of thousands of American lives. The attack shocked the nation and instantly unified public opinion in favor of war. The following day, the United States formally declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, drawing America fully into the global conflict. By the time it entered the war, the United States was no longer unprepared. The extensive planning, industrial expansion, and military training carried out during the war's early years allowed the country to mobilize with remarkable speed. American troops were soon deployed across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, fighting alongside Allied forces against both Germany and Japan. The scale of American involvement was unprecedented, with millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines serving across multiple theaters of war. The United States' contribution went beyond manpower alone. Its industrial capacity ensured a steady supply of weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and food not only for its own forces, but also for its allies. This logistical superiority proved decisive in prolonged campaigns, where resources and endurance were as important as battlefield tactics. The ability to sustain long-term warfare gave the Allies a critical advantage over the Axis powers. In retrospect, it has been proven beyond doubt that the United States' early preparation played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of World War II. While America may have entered the conflict later than many other nations, its readiness ensured that it could exert immense influence once it did. The combination of economic strength, industrial production, military organization, and global reach made the United States one of the central pillars of the Allied victory. Thus, while the United States initially maintained a distance from World War II, its actions during the early years of the conflict demonstrate that it was never truly disengaged. Through careful preparation and strategic foresight, America positioned itself to play a decisive role in one of the most significant conflicts in human history. During this critical period of World War II, the United States increasingly aligned itself with the British narrative and strategic outlook, even while officially maintaining a position of neutrality. American leadership, particularly under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, recognized that the survival of Great Britain was essential not only for the future of Europe, but also for global stability. Britain represented the last major barrier standing between Nazi Germany and total domination of Western Europe. As a result, American political, economic, and military thinking became closely tied to Britain's struggle against the Axis powers. By 1980, the situation for Britain and France had become extremely dire. Germany's rapid blitzkrieg campaigns overwhelmed much of Western Europe, leading to the swift fall of France in June 1940. Britain, left largely alone, faced relentless aerial bombardment during the Battle of Britain and the constant threat of invasion. At this moment of crisis, the United States emerged as Britain's most important external supporter. Although American troops were not yet fighting on European soil, the flow of American aid began to shape the direction of the war. One of the most significant ways in which the United States supported Britain and, later, other Allied nations was through the provision of military equipment and supplies. American factories produced vast quantities of aircraft, tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, and naval vessels. These supplies were transferred to Britain under arrangements that allowed immediate use without requiring immediate payment. This assistance ensured that Britain could continue fighting despite severe losses and limited domestic resources. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, formalized this process and marked a turning point in American involvement. Through this program, the United States supplied not only Britain, but also France's remaining forces, and later the Soviet Union, with essential war materials. Lend-Lease allowed the Allied powers to replace destroyed equipment, maintain supply lines, and sustain long-term resistance against the Axis. Without this continuous support, Britain's ability to withstand German pressure would have been severely compromised. Beyond material aid, American support also had a profound psychological and political impact. The knowledge that the United States stood firmly behind Britain boosted British morale during some of the darkest days of the war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill frequently emphasized the importance of American assistance, understanding that it represented hope for ultimate victory. The growing partnership between the two nations laid the foundation for the strong Anglo-American alliance that would later dominate Allied strategy. Although France had suffered military defeat in 1940, the United States continued to support French forces in exile and resistance movements. Supplies, intelligence, cooperation, and diplomatic backing helped keep the idea of a free France alive. This support proved essential when Allied forces later returned to Western Europe, relying on local resistance networks to undermine German control from within. It is often argued that while the United States did not fight alone in World War II, it became the decisive force that tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. This assessment is based not only on America's eventual military involvement, but also on its unmatched industrial and logistical capabilities. The United States possessed the economic strength to sustain a global war on multiple fronts, a feat that few nations could accomplish. By supplying its allies while simultaneously building its own armed forces, America created an overwhelming advantage. The scale of American production during the war was unprecedented. U.S. shipyards produced cargo vessels at astonishing speed, ensuring that supplies could reach distant battlefields. Aircraft factories delivered thousands of planes, giving the Allies air superiority in both Europe and the Pacific. This industrial output compensated for the manpower and resource shortages faced by Britain and other Allied nations, effectively multiplying their fighting strength. Strategically, American support allowed Britain to survive long enough for the balance of power to shift. Once the United States formally entered the war in 1941, the groundwork had already been laid for coordinated Allied offensives. Joint planning, shared intelligence, and combined military operations became possible because of the trust and cooperation established during the years of support prior to direct involvement. Critics sometimes argue that other nations bore the heaviest human costs of the war, particularly the Soviet Union. While this is undeniably true, it does not diminish the decisive role played by the United States. The war was not won by a single nation but by a coalition in which each member played a crucial role. America's contribution was unique in that it provided the resources, technology, and organizational capacity necessary to sustain that coalition over time. In conclusion, during the period when Britain and France were on the verge of collapse, the United States emerged as the backbone of Allied resistance. Through extensive military aid, economic support, and strategic alignment with the British narrative, America helped restore Allied strength and momentum. While it did not win World War II alone, the United States provided the decisive force that made victory possible. Without American support, the outcome of the war and the future of the modern world might have been dramatically different. During World War II, the United States possessed one of the largest and most rapidly mobilized military forces in human history. By the peak of the war, more than 15 million American men and women were available for combat and support roles across the globe. This extraordinary mobilization did not occur by chance. It was the result of deliberate government policy, industrial strength, and a nationwide effort that transformed ordinary civilians into disciplined soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. At the beginning of the war, the United States did not maintain a massive standing army. Instead, it relied on its ability to rapidly train and equip civilians when necessary. As the global conflict intensified, the American government introduced widespread conscription through the selective service system. Millions of young men from cities, towns, and rural communities were called into service. Farmers, factory workers, students, and clerks were suddenly immersed in rigorous military training designed to prepare them for the harsh realities of modern warfare. Training camps were established across the country, where recruits underwent physical conditioning, weapons training, tactical instruction, and discipline. These facilities operated around the clock, producing soldiers capable of fighting in vastly different environments. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of Europe and the jungles of the Pacific, the speed and efficiency with which civilians were transformed into combat-ready troops became one of America's greatest strengths during the war. Equally important was the United States, the ability to equip its massive force. American industry produced weapons and equipment on an unprecedented scale. Soldiers were supplied with modern rifles, artillery, armored vehicles, and aircraft, ensuring that American forces entered battle with technological and logistical advantages. This overwhelming material support allowed U.S. troops to sustain long campaigns without suffering the shortages that plagued many other nations. As American forces entered the European and Pacific theaters, their sheer size and resources earned the United States a reputation as the big elephant of the war, a powerful force that, once fully engaged, was impossible to stop. In Europe, American troops played a decisive role in major campaigns, such as the invasion of North Africa, the liberation of Italy, and the D-Day landings in Normandy. These operations placed immense pressure on Nazi Germany, forcing it to fight a costly war on multiple fronts. In the Pacific, American military power was equally overwhelming. U.S. forces confronted Imperial Japan in a series of brutal campaigns. Despite fierce resistance, American troops steadily advanced across the Pacific, using superior naval power, air dominance, and logistical support to wear down Japanese defenses. The combination of manpower and industrial strength allowed the United States to absorb losses while maintaining continuous pressure on the enemy. One of the most striking aspects of America's wartime experience was the relatively low number of military casualties compared to other major Allied powers. Approximately 400,000 American soldiers were killed during World War II, a tragic and significant loss, yet far smaller than the casualties suffered by nations such as Britain, France, and especially the Soviet Union. Several factors contributed to this difference, including later entry into the war, superior medical care, effective logistics, and strong air and naval support that reduced the exposure of ground troops to prolonged combat. American military doctrine emphasized coordination between land, sea, and air forces. This integrated approach allowed U.S. commanders to minimize unnecessary losses while maximizing battlefield effectiveness. Air superiority weakened enemy positions before ground assaults, while naval power ensured secure supply lines and rapid troop movement. These advantages reduced the need for costly frontal assaults that had caused devastating casualties during World War I. Furthermore, the United States benefited from fighting many of its major battles far from its own territory. Unlike European nations whose cities and populations endured constant bombardment and occupation, the American homeland remained largely untouched by direct combat. This allowed uninterrupted training, production, and mobilization throughout the war, strengthening the overall effectiveness of American forces. The human cost of the war, while lower in comparison, was still deeply felt across the United States. Nearly every American family was touched by the conflict in some way. The loss of 400,000 lives represented not only fallen soldiers but also shattered families and communities. However, the nation's ability to sustain these losses without collapsing reflected the depth of its manpower, reserves, and the strength of its home front support. By the end of World War II, the United States had demonstrated that modern warfare was no longer won solely by bravery on the battlefield, but by the ability to mobilize entire societies. America's success lay in its capacity to transform civilians into soldiers, industries into weapons factories, and economic power into military dominance. This transformation allowed the United States to confront and defeat powerful nations, such as Germany and Japan. In conclusion, the United States' massive military manpower, efficient training systems, and overwhelming industrial support turned it into the decisive big elephant of World War II, while American forces did not bear the heaviest casualties of the war. Their scale, coordination, and sustained pressure played a crucial role in crushing the Axis powers. The legacy of this mobilization reshaped global power structures and established the United States as a leading military force in the post-war world. It is evident that if the United States had not participated in World War II, the balance of power in Asia could have shifted dramatically in favor of Imperial Japan. By the early 1940s, Japan had already established itself as a formidable military and industrial power, with ambitions that extended far beyond its home islands. Its expansion into China, Korea, and Southeast Asia demonstrated a clear strategy, aimed at dominating the Asian continent and securing vital resources to sustain its war machine. Without American intervention, there would have been few forces capable of effectively resisting this expansion. Before the United States entered the war, Japanese forces had already achieved significant successes across Asia and the Pacific. Large parts of China were under Japanese occupation, and European colonial powers such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands were severely weakened by Germany's advance in Europe. Their Asian colonies were poorly defended, understaffed, and increasingly vulnerable. Japan took advantage of this situation, rapidly capturing territories such as Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, in Burma. These victories not only expanded Japan's influence but also provided access to oil, rubber, and raw materials essential for continued warfare. Had the United States remained neutral, Japan's dominance over Asia might have become permanent. American naval power, industrial capacity, and logistical strength were the primary obstacles preventing Japan from consolidating its control over the Pacific and East Asia. Without the U.S. Navy challenging Japanese fleets, sea lanes across the Pacific would have remained under Japanese control, allowing Tokyo to reinforce its territories and suppress resistance movements with far greater efficiency. The consequences of unchecked Japanese expansion would have been profound for the entire Asian continent. Many regions already suffering under colonial rule might have simply exchanged one form of domination for another. While Japan promoted the idea of Asia for Asians through its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the reality on the ground often involved harsh military rule, economic exploitation, and severe human rights abuses. Without American involvement, there would have been little external pressure to limit or reverse these policies. The Indian subcontinent presents an especially significant case when considering this alternate historical outcome. During World War II, India was still under British colonial rule, and its future was closely tied to the outcome of the global conflict. If Japan had succeeded in establishing uncontested dominance across Asia, it is conceivable that British control over India would have collapsed much earlier. Japanese forces had already reached Burma, placing them at the doorstep of British India. Further advances could have brought the subcontinent directly under Japanese military influence. In such a scenario, decisions regarding the political future of the Indian subcontinent, including the partition between India and Pakistan, might not have been shaped by British authorities or local leaders alone. Instead, these decisions could have been influenced or even dictated by Japanese strategic interests. Japan may have sought to install sympathetic governments, manipulate nationalist movements, or divide regions in ways that served its own military and economic goals. The long-term political landscape of South Asia could have been dramatically altered as a result. American participation in the war fundamentally changed this trajectory. The United States brought immense naval power to the Pacific, halting Japanese expansion and gradually pushing Japanese forces back through a series of costly but decisive campaigns. Battles such as Midway marked a turning point, destroying Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. From that moment onward, Japan was increasingly forced into a defensive posture, beyond military engagements. American industrial output played a critical role in sustaining Allied resistance throughout Asia. The United States supplied not only its own forces but also Allied armies operating in the region, including British and Commonwealth troops in India and Southeast Asia. This support ensured that Japan faced a coordinated and increasingly well-equipped opposition rather than isolated and weakened colonial forces. By the end of the war, Japan's defeat ensured that Asia did not fall under a single dominating power. Instead, the post-war period saw the gradual dismantling of colonial empires and the emergence of independent nations across the continent. While this transition was often difficult and uneven, it occurred within a global framework shaped by Allied victory rather than Japanese imperial rule. The American involvement was central to creating the conditions in which these political transformations could take place. The image of American soldiers returning home aboard a British naval ship after the end of World War II symbolically captures this shared Allied effort. It reflects not only the military cooperation between the United States and Britain, but also the broader international alliance that shaped the war's outcome. These soldiers represented a nation that had crossed oceans, fought on distant continents, and played a decisive role in determining the future of the world. Their return marked the conclusion of a conflict that reshaped global power structures. The United States emerged as a leading world power, while Japan was forced to abandon its imperial ambitions. Asia, though deeply scarred by war, was spared from long-term domination by a single militaristic empire. This outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, sacrifices, and the decisive intervention of nations willing to confront aggression. In conclusion, it is clear that American participation in World War II prevented Japan from establishing uncontested dominance over Asia without US involvement. The political fate of vast regions, including the Indian subcontinent, could have been determined by Japanese strategic interests. The presence of American forces, their eventual victory, and their return home after the war stand as powerful reminders of how global history can be shaped by the actions of a single nation at a critical moment in time.